I think it would be fair to say that many of us have a complicated relationship with Jaguar. Across their 90 years of building cars, the big cat has lolloped through peaks and troughs in building world-class racing cars, lithesome sports cars, controversial GTs and ill-focused saloons. Yet at the end of the 1960s, under the leadership of their founder, Sir William Lyons, Jaguar produced what is probably their greatest ever model, providing the full Jaguar experience. So today on TwinCam, this is the Series 2 Jaguar XJ6. Before we get into it, however, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics. So if you fancy floating about in something like this, then please do follow the link in the description. But I'm sure we're all aware that the original XJ led an extraordinarily long life. Variations upon this basic car being produced from 1968 all the way through to 1992. But the car we have before us today is of course a Series 2 XJ, built between 73 and 79, an era in which Jaguar ought to have been bearing the fruits of their labour. After all, these cars were phenomenally received back in 1968, many describing them as the best cars in the world. And indeed, by 1972, the 6-cylinder version of this car was augmented by the XJ12, at the time the only saloon car in the world with a 12-cylinder engine. Yet met with industrial turmoil and a stagnant economy, Jaguar found life much more difficult than they really should have done. So, in order to figure out where exactly Jaguar sat in the early 1970s, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. We often and quite fairly perceive Jaguar's glory days to be in the 1950s and 60s, with cars like the XK120, E-Type and the Mark II Saloon building our image of what a great Jaguar road car should look like. And certainly from an external perspective, building feline, beautiful cars that were the fastest in the world, all while winning Le Mans multiple times, was always going to create an aura around Jaguar products. Yet concurrently, Sir William Lyons kept them grounded. In 1948, Jaguar developed a single world-class engine that would power every car they built for the next 25 years, the twin-cam XJ6. And when they launched the E-Type in 1961, its new world-class independent rear suspension would be fitted to every single Jaguar for the next 35 years. Indeed, it's these components we see underpinning the XJ we're featuring today, a 4.2-litre XK up front and that E-Type style suspension at the rear. With that in mind, you might imagine that it was relatively easy for Browns Lane to come up with this new big saloon. But as the 1960s progressed, Jaguar fell into one of those troughs I mentioned before. Our baseline is the aforementioned Mark II, Jaguar's compact saloon that had originally debuted as the Mark I in 1955, for a time the fastest saloon car in the world. And in 1961, the E-Type joined the Mark II in becoming the fastest car in the world, full stop. But also using that new independent rear suspension was the gargantuan Jaguar Mark X. Launched virtually alongside the E-Type, the Mark X set new standards in terms of saloon car ride and handling, but it was ill-focused. For the European market, it was too big, too cumbersome and too expensive. Yet for the American market, it was poorly equipped, meaning that in spite of its engineering quality, the Mark X was a flop. Sure, everyone loved the E-Type, but in this company, the Mark II began to look old hat. With its simple live axle at the rear, it performed well compared to most of the competition, but Jaguar naturally looked to upgrade it, fitting that new rear suspension and a raft of other improvements to 1963's Jaguar S-Type. The problem with this car is that the Mark II continued to be produced alongside it, partly as an entry-level model, but mainly because while the S-Type was more capable and more comfortable than its father, it was also a shed load heavier, leading to relatively poor straight-line performance and desperate fuel economy. Jaguar were more than aware of their self-inflicted issues, and the car that became the XJ was their salvation. Not only was it due to replace all of their existing saloons, but it would be sensibly sized, sensibly priced, beautifully styled, and like so many big cats of its era, it would be phenomenal to drive. The XJ6 was waiting in the wings, but Jaguar still had to weather the storm of British industry, and by 1965, the stress was beginning to take its toll. Sir William Lyons had steered his ship well in the post-war years, but Browns Lane's tooling was dated. Strike action began to afflict production, and as their cars aged, Jaguar saloon production fell by a staggering 25% in 1966 alone. Without financing the firm to the hilt, there wasn't the money to productionise the XJ. So in July of that year, Lyons sold Jaguar to BMC. Then the nation's largest car producer, the British Motor Corporation, provided Jaguar with the capital they required, secured their previously outsourced body production, and Lyons was able to retain his day-to-day role of leading the company. After all, BMC's bread and butter were mainstream cars, Austins and Morrises, which barely overlapped with the luxury and pedigree of a Jaguar. With the XJ6 open to the world in September 1968, that should have been that. Jaguar, rescued from their turmoil by a giant of the industry, proud of their new and brilliant luxury saloon. And indeed, the XJ6 was the jewel in the crown of its maker. But in what became British Leyland, that crown was soon to be mediatised. Back in 1966, BMC were in a relatively decent position. They had a range of ultra-modern family cars, many of which were runaway successes, and so they should have been rolling in it. Instead, the new Austins and Morrises were expensive to produce and were proving unreliable. Sir William Lyons had always been financially savvy as Mr. Jaguar, yet within 18 months of their purchase, BMC were failing as well. The government recognised that allowing BMC to fail would have been an economic and industrial calamity, so organised their merger with Leyland. The latest problem is that the newly founded British Leyland was unwieldy, full of contradictions and internal competition for Jaguar. The likes of Rover and Triumph, who were partly responsible for Jaguar's drop in sales, were now competing for resources, placing the XJ6 in a deeply difficult position. But placing politics aside and bringing us to this Series 2 car, and the XJ was proving to be surprisingly popular. Surprising not because Jaguar didn't expect it to sell in decent numbers, but because it was so popular that they couldn't keep up with demand. In the spring of 1972, Browns Lane was building 650 XJs per week. And unlike the majority of British cars of this time period, Jaguar were also exporting it in decent numbers. In fact, their export percentage never fell below 50%. And so in the April of that year, Jaguar hired a further 900 workers, employing night shifts to up production to 1,000 cars per week. That is the context which birthed this facelift XJ as an update of a fabulously received and deeply popular luxury car. So let us figure out exactly why that is. This car, in its most 70s of colour schemes, could be confused for little other than a Jaguar. Even in 2025, for most of us, Jaguar's style is firmly grounded in 1968, and that can be partly credited to just how pretty the Series XJs are. Being a Series 2, this car does feature a number of alterations, most critically a shallower grille with raised bumpers, all to meet US crash legislation. In my view, that does slightly corrupt the beauty of a Series 1, but it's left largely intact. But the longevity of this silhouette has had some serious consequences, where folks who proclaim their support for Jaguar recoil in horror at their eventual and expected moving on. Yet in the era of the Mark II and XK150, Jaguars were curvy, with big ovular grilles and flowing wings. But as any other manufacturer did, they knew they had to modernise. So morphed that style through the narrow-nosed E-Type and cliff-faced Mark X to culminate in the XJ6. This car may share its general face with the Mark X, but its sharpness towards the rear was totally novel for Jaguar, and it's proof of the folly of trying to live in the past. This car was still very much a Jaguar, but it was utterly contemporary, graceful yet forceful back in 1968. I feel we had to talk that through as people's frame of reference for Jaguar is degraded by this silhouette's longevity. Make no mistake, the XJ6 was different, and it was a collaboration between Mr. Jaguar himself, Sir William Lyons, and the firm's aerodynamicist, the great Malcolm Sayer. This era of Jaguars towed the line between artistry and practicality, Lyons working on the former, stories of schoolchildren peering through his garden bushes to catch the man sketching cars in the afternoon. Sayer's job wasn't merely to maximise the efficiency of those shapes, however, as in years gone by, he led the D-Type and E-Type projects. At its nose, the XJ is distinctive. The grilles and their relationship with the bumper I do feel is slightly scruffy, but it opens out through the hooded contours of the bonnet into total perfection. The profile that scallops the door angles sharply towards the sills, gifting it a lithesomeness and a sense of sporting purpose that no contemporary saloon car could match. The haunches below the rear window mirror this, before feeding so cleanly into the subtly peaked rear lamps. So many large saloons, then and now, appear slab-sided, with solidity and strength at the centre of their visual character. The Jaguar, on the other hand, embraces and illustrates a feline sense of grace. Proof of its success is in how natural the XJ appears when slicing through the countryside. Few cars can appear classy while parked beside a hotel, yet aggressive and focused while doing what a Jaguar always did best: driving. To those ends, the XJ6 features what was probably the best chassis, and certainly the most sophisticated, of any saloon in the world back in 1968. In fact, it took until the 1980s for Mercedes-Benz to catch up with what Jaguar had started doing in the early 1960s. We mentioned at the start how the S-Type, the Mark X and the E-Type all had essentially the same suspension setup. And of course that is exactly what we find beneath this XJ we're driving today. At the front we have double wishbones and coil springs. Now, double wishbones were the standard on British cars for many, many years, but that doesn't mean that they are not also the purest form of passenger car suspension. In fact, BMW traditionally always used McPherson struts, and yet only 10-15 years ago they started switching to double wishbones, as we see under here. And the new Porsche 911 GT3 was marketed by Porsche as now finally having double wishbone front suspension. Yet this is what we have in our over 50-year-old Jaguar here. And at the back, of course, we have Jaguar's famous independent rear suspension. And I said before that it was sophisticated, and I'm definitely not lying. The rear differential sits essentially within a cradle, and then you have the rear disc brakes immediately on either side of that, mounted inboard for less unsprung weight. You then have some suspension arms emanating from it, acting as your lower arms, and the drive shafts act as the upper arms. So if you were being kind, you could again say that we have double wishbones at the back. But this time we have 4 coil springs. 4 coil springs all just at the back, keeping this car as controlled as possible. Additionally, you could say that therefore this, in a sense, is kind of an E-Type saloon. It certainly has all the hallmarks of that car. It has the engineering sophistication of that car. But what all that sophistication gives us, most importantly, is a sense of refinement. So in this car, I'm not immediately met by a sense of agility or ability. Instead, it's nothing. The amount by which that I am cosseted, I am pushed away from the engine, from the road, is quite frankly scary. As I said, this is an over 50-year-old car, and there are many modern luxury cars that have a ride quality and a sense of detachment that does not match this car. But I'm afraid to tell you that what that does mean is that the steering has absolutely no feel in it whatsoever. Of course, it's power assisted, but we still have this enormous rim just because that's what you get from this era. And a very nice steering wheel it is too, but it just means there is not much feel in this car at all. The car feels very planted on the road. It's confidence inspiring in terms of the platform's ability, but in terms of its feedback and how it interacts with you as a driver, it just does not give that feedback. It is not a sporty feeling saloon car, in spite of all that sophistication and in spite of the pedigree that the underpinnings of this car have. Instead, you kind of drive it like a chauffeur. You drive this car how I would imagine you drive a Daimler limousine, which of course is again based on these same mechanical components: XJ6, double wishbones, Jag independent rear end. It feels like a limousine. And I suppose if you're buying a car like this, that is absolutely what you would have wanted. If you would, on the other hand, have bought an XJ Coupe with its 2-door layout, and of course maybe with the V12 as well, then maybe you would have wanted something slightly more direct in terms of the steering. But as it sits here, this car just feels ever so cosseting. But I did mention the level of solidity that you get in the platform of this thing, and it is so flat. You would expect something with such great ride comfort. You would expect it to have a level of wallow in the corners. You'd expect body roll even in a modern car, never mind in something that is naturally sprung so much softer, but you just don't get it. You get a little bit of the front wings lifting up as you go around a corner, but otherwise it's ridiculously flat. But the Series 2 car was more than just a simple facelift, because it has a totally revised bulkhead which insulates you all that more from the engine. It also has side impact beams in the doors, so it's safer than a Series 1. And inside we have a new dashboard with some extra ventilation, which I'm sure makes it a heck of a lot more comfortable in the summer. But what was not changed, of course, was the dual overhead cam XJ6. The glorious XJ6 more than deserves its legendary status. After all, it had powered every post-war Jaguar up to this point, and besides being smooth and delivering adequate power, these units also sound immense. If you've never heard a racing E-Type at full chat, I implore you to witness their majesty in person. But of course, Jaguar recognised some of its flaws, And while the XJ was always planned to be launched as a 6-pot, they were in the process of developing an all-new modular engine for the Series 2, which would have made this 4.2 litre car not an XJ6, but instead an XJ8, thanks to an all-alloy overhead camshaft V8. Now, of course, I'm sure you're thinking about the Daimler V8 that Jaguar had the use of throughout the 1960s. And questions remain about why such a unit was abandoned in spite of many people's views that it would have been a better choice for the Series 1 XJ. My guess is that if Jaguar were planning this ground-up V8, then the switch from XJ6 to XJ8 could have been really beautifully marketed. Regardless, the 6's competence, British Leyland's lack of funds and some serious refinement issues forced its abandonment. A Jaguar XJ8 may have had to wait until the 1990s to appear, but as a modular design, its big brother was allowed to live on. In 1972, just before the Series 2 came along, we were fortunate to meet the Jaguar XJ12, the only 12-cylinder saloon car in the world. Now, of course, I'd love to be driving an XJ12 today, and I'm afraid I've never driven the ultimate 70s saloon car. But conversely, I have experienced the Jaguar V12 under the bonnet of an XJS, and in spite of some people's scepticism, it is smooth yet brisk, quiet yet sonorous, and so utterly supreme with the telltale badge on its nose. But I'm here to labour the point because the V12's fortunes are central to the life of the Series 2, though it's all thanks to its relative failure. That may sound like a misprint in the context of our earlier discussion, but within only months of the XJ12 becoming widely available, the Western world was plunged into the depths of the oil crisis. OPEC's embargo in the wake of the Yom Kippur War caused fuel prices to double almost overnight, and with Jaguar's classic champagne for beer money mantra, those who would have been considering the ultimate in engine layouts were now second-guessing whether they could live with a 5.3 litre engine and an official urban economy figure of 10.9 miles per gallon. A 4.2 litre XJ6 like the one we have before us would still drink like a frightened sparrow at a birdbath, but at cruising speeds you'd see economy figures up to 50% higher than you would in an XJ12. We established before how the XJ was only launched thanks to the money injected by British Leyland, but as the entire group slid towards oblivion, the jewel in their crown, blessed though it was, proved unable to provide the fruits born of its 12-cylinder engine. We'll return to the XJ's falling star in a little while, because for now, we are driving a 4.2 litre XJ6, and that means 168 brake horsepower. That is quite lazy, isn't it? It's not quite American lazy, but very lazy nonetheless this is. However, the smaller 3.4 litre engine produces 162 brake horsepower. So the reason you would go for this 4.2 litre is not because of the additional power. There isn't any. Instead, what you get is a bump up from 184 to 222 pounds-feet of torque. And peak power is made at 4,750 revs. Now, this isn't a particularly revvy engine to start with, but that means that it's accessible power. And the torque is produced at only 3,000. So for a dual overhead camshaft engine from this kind of era, you buy the 4.2 because it's tractable, because it gives you that kind of limousine feeling of effortless pace and grace. And I've just gone straight into some old Jaguar marketing there. But I love it. It makes a lot of sense for this car with its automatic gearbox and that attitude I got from its platform and suspension and steering, of course, slightly earlier. Of course, if you wanted the power, you just go for a V12, don't you? A car which makes a whopping 285 brake horsepower. It really does get a shift on though when you start going. I must admit, this thing is just absolute supremacy. You feel amazing in a car like this, one that's so beautiful from this kind of period of history with this kind of interior. And then it has that engine, which, you know, it does take a bit to get going, but it just lights up when it does. And the platform as well, it is so confidence inspiring. Oh, I'd have one of these. I would so very, very have one of these. What we learn, therefore, is that although this car was not radical, I mean, sure, the engines were originally planned to, but the entire car, especially as an XJ6, is not radical compared to its predecessors. But the sophistication that was built into these basic Jaguar systems, the refinement that we get from this particular car, and how it's making me feel now, proves why Jaguar did not need to break molds. And it proves why Jaguar could get away with selling this car for so very, very long. By the time these Series 2 cars made their debut, you'd have expected the XJ to be reaching middle age. After all, Mercedes-Benz pulled the covers off the W116, the first to be officially known as the S-Class in 1972. And though mechanically it still couldn't match the Jaguar, what with semi-trailing arm rear suspension and a frankly embarrassing lack of 12 cylinders, it had the one feature the British just could not match: quality. Now, I'm not going to sit here and wax on about perception. Instead, Jaguar were very clear that their luxury cars were not assembled to the same standards as many of their counterparts. As I said, champagne for beer money. And in evidence of this, Jaguar and Daimler saloons were spread across a vast chasm of the market, between £2,700 for an entry-level 2.8 and nearly £5,500 for a Daimler Vanden Plas. This meant that in 1972, the XJ6 could be had for similar money to a Citroën DS, Lancia Flavia and Rover P5. A little dearer were the likes of the Volvo 164 and Mercedes-Benz 220, the classic equivalent of a 4-cylinder E-Class. In this company, we see the sheer value you could get out of a Jaguar. But even if we move up to the 5.3 litre fuel-injected XJ12, sitting at £3,700, your alternatives were meagre. A 2.5 litre New 6 BMW, for example. If you yearned for the benefits of a 3 litre fuel-injected BMW, then you had to fork out nearly the price of the full-fat Daimler, at which level you could also have the 3.5 litre Mercedes-Benz 280 SE. Now, I'm sure that to some buyers, those further up the ladder, this range of prices devalued the XJ's image. But as Jaguar's only saloon car, it had to be a volume seller. And with our earlier discussion about expansion in Browns Lane's capacity, that's exactly what it was. In 1970, for example, Jaguar were building more cars than they ever had before, all in spite of this new single model starting at a price far in excess of the old Mark II. As you'll probably be able to tell by now, I really rather like this car. I've gone to some serious lengths in extolling its virtues, and though we will get to what started to go wrong later on, I first want to contextualise for you just how peerless this car really was. As the video's title suggests, it was often referred to as the best car in the world, and in their first review back in 1968, Autocar said that as it stands at the moment, dynamically, the XJ6 has no equal regardless of price, which explains those 12-month delivery quotes from dealers. We set it as a new yardstick, a tremendous advance guaranteed to put it ahead for several years at least. Whenever I use a period review, however, some bright spark in the comments retorts and says that, of course, a British car was liked by the British press. it's British after all, and to that I always bring out an old copy of Car magazine, the publication that the manufacturers all hated for they weren't afraid of flying too close to the sun. And of the Jaguar XJ6, they made it their car of the year. Indeed, the great Mr. Setright proclaimed that the Jaguar is not merely remarkable for what it is, but also because it makes redundant all cars that cost more. I can think of no car of which this can be as truthfully said, and I would consider this fact alone as qualifying the XJ6 for the award. Just to push the point home further, both of brilliance and of value, Autocar said that if Jaguar were to double the price of the XJ6 and bill it as the best car in the world, we would be right behind them. So why then did it all go so pear-shaped? The overwhelming image of 1970s British industry is one beset by industrial action. And indeed, the XJ's production was increasingly limited by strikes. Yet though Jaguar themselves were by no means immune, the majority of early hold-ups were down to suppliers, meaning the folks at Browns Lane continued filling up their car parks with brand new XJ6s, but ones missing features like radiator grills. When engine supply dried up, however, the lines had to come to a halt. But as the 70s really began to hit, the government lost its grip through poorly received legislation. The lights went out and energy shortages became the norm, and the spectre of unrest grew steadily to severely haunt Jaguar. The simple fact is that with a stagnant economy, stagnant wages, a factory from the 1940s and stoppages caused by external suppliers, the folks building cars they could barely dream of affording were not going to stay on side for long. By the launch of the XJ12, cars were selling for huge premiums because supply was so restricted, Jaguar-wide production dropping by a third in only 2 years, while an image began to propagate. Through its association with the wider British Leyland and quality levels remaining dreadfully low, British buyers looking for a new premium saloon began to experience and enjoy the quality found in lower specification but actually available imported cars. And as for Jaguar's wonderful history of exporting their cars, buyers overseas were more than happy to go back to supporting their own car industries. When supplies did pick back up, people couldn't afford one anymore and were unwilling to trust Jaguar, a turn of events that still undoubtedly haunts them today. The best car in the world, yet one you couldn't have and eventually no longer wanted. But in spite of everything, Jaguar continued to make money. The firm had planned for new paint plants, larger facilities, and changed mentalities to address the poor production standards. But the money they would have loved to protect was pulled away by British Leyland. The hand that saved them and secured the XJ's production was by now breaking their character. The overarching example of Jaguar's financial stretching was the Series XJ's replacement, originally slated for launch by 1978. With bigger fish to fry and no one from the train wreck of Austin Morris coming to assist, the new car, known as XJ40, would wait until after Jaguar's floating off from BL, till 1986, to finally reach production. In the story of just this Series 2 Jaguar XJ, we've travelled from applause and unprecedented demand to stagnation and abandonment. With our worldview of 1973 very much established, we recognise the value of something some would rather we didn't today: nuance. The early success of the XJ6 very much secured the immediate future of Jaguar, gifting them the means to battle manufacturers with endlessly larger budgets. And of course, the XJ12 ought to have pushed Jaguar further along that path, but as world events intervened, it turned out to be poorly timed. The Series 2 marked itself out, therefore, as the trough in the varying highs of the original Jaguar XJ. As the later Series 3 stood up well to its more modern 1980s competition, Brown's Lane production recovered not only to its 1970 level, but indeed exceeded that. Yet of course, that's a story for another day. You and I have now studied dozens of classic British cars with immense potential. But the overriding theme is that they all emerge misguided or coarsely finished in a manner that scuppers all that potential. The Jaguar XJ6, however, realised its potential in a way none of its contemporaries were able to, making it undoubtedly British Leyland's shining light as it slid towards oblivion, meaning that in its own era, it could be described as little other than a roaring success. Yet without the ability to maintain a sense of quality or develop a suitable replacement, all the goodwill and sales success garnered by this car was whittled away by Jaguar's overseas rivals. As I said earlier, the Series XJs were produced all the way through to 1992. And as this silhouette then became so ingrained in Jaguar's history and Jaguar's character, it was emulated consistently through to 2009. It's funny, isn't it, what history and context can do to a car, but undoubtedly the product of Jaguar's glory days led directly to their downfall. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.